Welcome to today's webinar, Police Unions in the House of Labor. My name is Claire Hammonds. I'm a faculty member at the University of Massachusetts Amherst Labor Center, where I coordinate the UMass Labor Extension Program on our Amherst campus. The UMass Labor Extension Program is a statewide effort based at all 4 of our UMass campuses at Amherst, Boston, Dartmouth, and Lowell. Our aim is to provide training and education to workers, their unions, and other workers' organizations. Really, the focus of the program is on strengthening these organizations, increasing activism, and building skills necessary to effectively advocate for the needs and concerns of the workforce. I want to start our session today by recognizing the other members of the UMass Labor Extension Program who've also been involved in coordinating this effort today. It's Annetta Argyris, who's at the UMass Boston Labor Program, Elizabeth Pellerito at UMass Lowell, and Kim Wilson, who's at UMass Dartmouth. So just by way of providing a little context for how this event evolved, in the month of May, we've really seen these unprecedented protests in every state around the country demanding an end to police brutality and a transformation of policing in America. And police unions have very much been at the center of that conversation because of the role that they've too often played in shielding officers from accountability. While we acknowledge that talking about police unions is just one part of a broader conversation about white supremacy and about anti-Black racism, both in our organizations and in the broader society, it's one that labor is urgently called to confront at this moment. This event really developed out of a need we were all seeing in the labor movement and in the local unions and local councils that we work with to consider this relationship between police unions and the larger labor movement. Unions are very diverse places with different actors, different ideas, and different perspectives. Examining this issue of police unions is challenging and often deeply uncomfortable because doing so forces us to grapple with this diversity while also answering these really fundamental questions of what is this movement and who is it for. Well, we certainly don't expect to get to all of that in today's conversation and resolve this issue. We hope that we can shed light on some of the complexity and various ways of thinking and addressing it. Just in terms of logistics of how this webinar is going to be run, you'll notice that the chat feature has been turned off. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions of the panelists using the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Finally, I'd also say that this session is being recorded and it will be available to people who have registered for the session. So next I'd like to get to just introduce our guests for today. First, I'd like to introduce Bill Fletcher, who's going to be facilitating this conversation. Bill is a longtime labor and racial justice activist and international activist. Over the years, he's been active in workplace and in community struggles, as well as in electoral campaigns. He's worked for several labor unions in addition to serving as a senior staff person in the National AFL-CIO. Fletcher is a former president of Trans-Africa Forum, a senior scholar with the Institute for Policy Studies, and an editorial board member of blackcommentator.com. Fletcher is also the author of numerous books, including Solidarity Divided, A Crisis in Organized Labor, and A New Path Towards Social Justice. I would just say that Bill has been writing and talking extensively on these issues of police unions, including an article I would encourage you all to look at that appeared last week in These Times that was titled, "The Central Issue is Police Repression, Not Police Unions." I'd now like to introduce our 3 panelists. First, we have Katie Garrow, who's the Deputy Executive Secretary at the MLK Labor Council, which is the labor council that represents over 100,000 workers in Seattle and in the suburbs. Katie leads the council's policy work on public sector collective bargaining and infrastructure, transportation, energy, and workforce development. She began in the labor movement by organizing day laborers in San Francisco and later worked as a union rep where she learned to use collective bargaining to fight racism and discrimination at work. Katie's economic analysis is deeply informed by growing up in a rural, poor, former logging town on Washington's coast. I would also just note that yesterday night, the MLK Labor Council voted to expel the Seattle Police Officers Guild in a vote of 45,435 yes to 36,760 no. Our next guest is Tiffany Loftin. Tiffany serves as the National Director for the Youth and College Division at the NAACP. Her mission is to train, organize, and uplift young Black leaders everywhere who fight for the racial, social, and economic equality of all people. Prior to this, Tiffany spent 5 years in national labor union organizing, working at the AFT, the NEA, and the AFL-CIO. As a labor civil rights organizer, she created the labor union's only national curriculum that helps workers understand how race and inequality are part of every collective bargaining fight. She helped to create coalitions with community organizations like Black Lives Matter, Dream Defenders, and United We Dream. Under her leadership, she coordinated a national commission of 30 presidents, national presidents, and vice presidents to meet with local community leaders and address issues of police brutality, healthcare, and racism in the union. And finally, I'd like to introduce our third panelist, Scott Roberts, who's the Senior Director of Criminal Justice Campaigns for Color of Change. He leads digital campaigners, researchers, and field organizers in rallying support to end mass incarceration, fight the way our society criminalizes Black people, and secure more humane treatment for those in contact with the justice system. Some of his team's key accomplishments, including making New York the first city in the country to offer free phone calls from jail and holding Color of Change's Mama's Day bailout, where Color of Change and partners raised bail money to free nearly 150 Black women around Mother's Day. Recently, he also worked with the Writers Guild of America East on a June 8th resolution that made the Guild the first national union to call for the AFL-CIO to break up with the International Union of Police Associations. I just want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today and for all of the attendees. And I'm going to turn the conversation over to Bill. Thanks a lot.
Okay, all right, now I can talk. I think the NSA was interfering with this. I want to thank UMass Labor Extension for this, and I want to dedicate today's program to the late Jose Solera, former director of the Labor Center at UMass Dartmouth, also a personal friend and comrade, and someone who I think a lot of us miss, and know that if he was around, he'd be a very energized participant in today's discussion. So basically, we're going to handle this like a talk show. And so just think about me as Stephen Colbert, even though I look better. And so we're going to be having this discussion. And then we're going to open it up for your questions and comments. And I wanted to start by asking the panel, and I'm going to pick on Tiffany because I know her. But I want to start by asking each of you, when you either saw or heard about the murder of George Floyd, what did you feel and what did you think? Tiffany.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you. It's also, unfortunately, we have to say this, it's good to see y'all. Y'all look great. Can't wait to go back outside. I do this work as a profession, but it is also very personal work for me. And in the wake of the murder of Ahmaud Arbery by white vigilantes in Georgia, my job directly is supporting the NAACP chapters on the ground with what's happening there and calling for justice with the district attorney. I woke up that morning to look at my cell phone to see the latest developments of what we had already been doing around the death of Ahmaud Arbery, just to find out that someone else had been killed and it had been recorded on their camera, and now it was going viral on social media. I don't know how many folks resonate with this. I know that folks who look like me do, but when that happens, there's a heavy weight that doesn't allow you to get out of bed. There's a heavy weight that causes more rage than any other feeling that I could probably have. And because of the health pandemic that we're in, our options for self-care and community care are limited. And I live at home by myself in a one-bedroom apartment. And so there's not many options that I have to deal with the trauma, the triggering, the pain, the frustration, the rage, the fear when videos like that pop up. And so now my responsibility was to make sure that I do not leave my folks in Georgia hanging, but now pivot to working with our folks in Minneapolis. And Leslie Redmond, who is our NAACP state conference president there, who's just a couple years older than me, is pretty phenomenal and amazing as to how quickly she was able to move and organize our partners on the ground. But that weight is exhausting. And since then, we cannot talk about George Floyd without talking about Breonna Taylor, without talking about Tony McDade, without talking about Nina Pop, without talking about the lives that have been lost since then, because I feel like I've experienced death on Black folks every day since then. So there's not a happy way to say how we're doing, because it's not real. But this work requires more than just Black people standing up and spreading the news and sticking up for ourselves. It requires a coalition of folks who are co-conspirators, who are going to stand in the gap, so that I'm not just dealing with the pain, but also dealing with the rage that I have against this country.
Thank you. Katie.
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. I watched the video of George Floyd's murder, and it was awful. It's like an absolutely horrifying experience to watch someone take another person's life in real time. And yeah, I mean, I was overcome with like disgust and sadness. What I thought was, damn, I need to self-reflect about how I can use my power and my relationships to do more. And I thought about my colleagues and friends who are Black people, and like, if I was affected in the way that I was, I couldn't even fathom like the grief and the burden that they had been feeling for so long, and that they must have been feeling and carrying in that moment. And then 3 days later, we here in Seattle saw a petition from BIPOC union members in Seattle calling on our labor council to expel the Police Officers Guild. And I was in a place of much deeper self-reflection on the issue of racism than I probably had been. And so, so it caused me to really take that petition seriously, and in a way that that maybe I wouldn't have if I hadn't been in such a self-reflective state before.
Thank you. Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. I just want to also just appreciate the invite to speak here, and I think this question is a great place to start. I appreciate Tiffany and Katie's sharing of your experiences. For me, this was tough. I think Katie used the word devastating to watch the video, for sure. To see someone, kneel on someone's neck for more than 8.5 minutes and take their life is really hard to watch. But for me, I think I felt a certain level of conviction, as a younger organizer, 5 years ago, deeply involved in building a movement for Black Lives and responding to incidents and working with young and Black organizers in, everywhere from Ferguson to Baltimore, even before that, responding to the death of Trayvon Martin and the lack of a conviction for George Zimmerman. I think, Tiffany, you and I met, both supporting the work of the Dream Defenders in Florida. There was so, at that time, that felt like real momentum, and it was police violence that had sparked a movement that has, built an opportunity for a lot of reform in the criminal justice system. And we've seen changes in pretrial justice and bail reform. We've seen sentencing and prison reforms. Not everything that we need to accomplish, not even close to that, but relative to what's happened in policing, we haven't seen a lot. And I just think feeling that, having a sense that we hadn't made progress and that we were back again in the same place. And that even as the protests started to unfold, seeing kind of what felt like the same cycles playing out. I think at this point, I think I feel differently, I think it seems like there has been a breakthrough in this moment. Whether it's permanent or not, I wouldn't, dare to say, but that there is an opportunity. It's sad that we have to lose our folks for this to happen. When Black communities have been saying this for a long time, but I think I feel a different type of conviction now that we need to take advantage of this moment and make sure that it's real movement, that we get real change this time. I think in previous instances, we've accepted kind of false solutions, or like I said, we've allowed ourselves to focus on other areas of work. But I think for us, we're really wanting to double down and deliver. A lot of folks are looking to organizations like the NAACP and Color Change for leadership, and feeling just a sense of conviction that wanting to step up to that challenge and make sure that this time, everything that's happening ends up really leading to some real systemic changes.
So our main task today is to really get into this discussion about police unions and where they fit in. But before we get into this is all like kind of laying the foundation. In the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, protests and rebellions started breaking out. And there were varying kinds of responses from organized labor. And I'm interested from you, the panel, I'm going to start with you, Katie, how you assess the responses to this moment from organized labor. What are people doing well and what are they not doing so well?
Well, some unions have been running anti-racism programs internally for years. And, locally unions like UFCW 21 and SEIU 1199 Northwest are two local unions here in Seattle who have some of the most robust racial justice programs internally. And, they are the ones who led on this work inside of our labor council. And, they're the ones who are leading this moment locally. And they have pushed our labor council to essentially, like, the tactic we've taken is to try and identify leaders of the protests here on the ground and make inroads with those folks to ask, like, in this moment, what would you like the role of organized labor to be? Like, in what way can the labor movement aid the movement for Black lives? And trying to take a position of, like, humility and saying, we know we haven't always been there for you. We know that our movement has a spotty past, but what would you like of us at this time? Here's a list of 7 things we have available, like, that we think we can do. And they are things like We think we can show up with masks. We think we can do civil disobedience trainings. We think we can help you elevate your demand to defund the police, et cetera, right? We think we can aid you with financial assistance. And then being willing to take lead from those folks about what they would like, and then providing it, and not assuming that we have the answer of what is best needed. And that can be hard for some of our organizations, but for us as the Central Labor Council, that's the position we've tried to take as leadership of the organization, is one of deference and humility. And, I think there's also simultaneously been this movement underfoot to kick the Seattle Police Officers Guild, our Seattle Police Union, out of our labor council. And that movement came from Black, Indigenous, people of color union members who circulated a petition and who began an emailing campaign to our executive board. And one of the local teachers unions passed a resolution that came to our board to expel that organization to expel the guild from our organization. And I think that that's a good step, but I think it's only the first step for us. And that, Bill, you wrote in your article that if in these times, that if all we did was expel a police guild from a labor federation, but didn't back it up with some real actionable steps, it would just be a step in political correctness, or it would just be symbolic. And I think that's right. I think it's on us to now follow that up with some strong actionable steps to execute a racial justice program within our institution. Otherwise, what was the point?
Tiffany, you used to work for the AFL-CIO. You can, thinking about this both as a former staff person, but also looking now externally, how would you answer that in terms of what the unions have done well and what they haven't done so well?
Yeah, my role at the national AFL-CIO was the racial justice coordinator. My position actually was a position that didn't exist before I got there. They created it after the death of Michael Brown, because they recognized that the AFL-CIO and the labor movement itself had needed support and had a gap with being able to first have the conversation about race, talk about the tensions in the community and to the labor movement. And so my job was literally hired to do all of that work after the death of Michael Brown, which is how, like Scott said earlier, him and I had met. I will say this, I have seen, and I've been tracking, I actually have a thread with all the folks at the AFL-CIO who used to work there with me, and we'll share some of the latest information that we received via articles. Bill, yours article came up in that thread as well, which is how I know about it. And what I've seen is surface level, well, let me say this. I worked at the AFL-CIO in 2015. That's when I started. And even when we tried to have this same conversation about police, about Black Lives Matter, when I was there, I asked the question to the labor movement, what would success look like for this national movement with the position that y'all hired me for? And the response that I got from leadership was, it's like pornography, you'll know it when you see it. And the work that was done that was permissible was very specific to just curriculum and just programs. My job was to work with the presidents and vice presidents of the international labor unions, to travel across the country to do listening sessions with communities of color in the labor movement, and sit down with partner organizations in the community on this national road trip. And the findings of that came out in a report that you can still find online, along with the curriculum. And now I'm looking at what did we learn from 2015 that has moved us to be better positioned to have the conversation now, and the answer is nothing. I'm still seeing just Black Lives Matter, barely, because back in 2015, they were scared to say Black Lives Matter because of the tension it might cause. Now I'm seeing folks say Black Lives Matter. Now I'm seeing folks say we need to have internal trainings around racial biases and racism and prejudice and et cetera. and I've seen also, I don't know if folks have watched Kenneth Rigmaiden, the president of IUPAT, who came out and talked about his own personal experience as a Black man being in the labor movement and how his parents struggled through racism in this country, and how his position, is a testament to the hard work that his elders and that his parents have done. But I'm not looking for talking points or branding. I'm not looking for folks to be out in the streets at the protests with their union gear on to show me that they were there. I'm looking for unions to come to the table and have the very difficult conversation that they have, I feel like, been afraid to have with police unions about accountability. We have the same conversations, you named it in my bio. I have the same conversations with teachers at the National Education Association, at the American Federation of Teachers. When teachers do something wrong, right? There is a conversation that is had, a difficult conversation nonetheless, but a conversation that is had about respect and accountability in our schools with our parents and with our community members. That same strategy is not applied to police. And I don't think it would be as easy as teachers, because teachers come to the table. Police unions haven't came to the table. In my experience working with the AFL-CIO, there were multiple times where we tried to bring police to the conversation and they told us no. I actually have 2 letters that I saved since my time working there, because the letters were so disgusting that the local union presidents of the police unions were telling us that they weren't going to come to the table because they think that we vilified them before they arrived. And so, there's a lot of tension there. But Bill, I'm not looking for programs. I'm not looking for trainings. I'm looking for the opportunity for folks to bring police unions to the table to have a difficult conversation about accountability, what that means for the narrative about unions altogether. And as Katie said earlier, I also want people to come to the table with local organizations. Scott and I have worked with and know folks in the Movement for Black Lives, and I don't know how many unions have actually reached out to them to say, hey, we saw your policy platform recommendations. We know that you're trying to defund, reform, or abolish the police. Let's have a conversation about it. I have not seen that platform from labor unions, unless it's just, let's get rid of chokeholds. And I think that we can all agree that the chokehold is not the thing that we need to be talking about solely, that there's a bigger problem than that. So I think that that summarizes the answer to the question. But I want to make sure that folks hear that I think that there is a deeper fear of having that honest discussion. And until the labor movement is able to do that, they will not be successful.
Scott, same question.
Yeah, I think of all the panelists, I'm the least inside labor person in the conversation. Unlike the rest of you, I have not worked directly in organized labor. I have, worked closely and collaborated with labor organizers. My last 15 years of doing this work. I grew up in a labor household. Obviously I'm a big supporter, but I'm not in the group chats like Tiffany. With labor organizers. So I have maybe my—
You can switch places. I'll put you in the group chat instead.
Oh, no, I'm good. I got enough group chats in my life. But but I think having a little bit of an outside perspective as someone who works, has been doing work primarily in racial justice spaces, I think, I'm clear that one, there's a long history, of struggles around race, even within organized labor. I think at its best, organized labor is, and the labor movement, shows up and creates opportunities for all people, and particularly has been a tool for building the Black middle class, to the extent that there is one. But I think in response to these instances, it's important to see labor unions, standing up, issuing public support. I think it's a weird moment now because that's coming from all corners. You're seeing some corporations that are, some of them are the worst of the worst and perpetrators of everything that we're talking about right now, also coming out with statements that look the same, so you would think you'll want to see more from organized labor. I think the biggest thing is, how do we get the labor movement to show up in a real way in these fights around policy? How do we leverage the power that labor unions have? I think, in my experience working in a lot of local places, like there's oftentimes just like somebody in organized labor, like you can get them on board, you can get the dominoes can start to fall, right? And so I think that's a space that we're just moving into right now. But I feel like we haven't heard a lot from organized labor as this conversation is playing out in Congress. I think it would be important. I think Katie said, for organized labor and the labor movement to show up in these fights around defunding the police and reinvesting in our communities, which I think actually connects with a lot of goals of a lot of labor unions. So I think, that's what I would love to see more. I think one moment that was important, though, that I will give to labor, especially the AFL, I think there was that night where the AFL headquarters here in DC was targeted. And I remember getting messages that morning like, oh no, we're going to turn organized labor against against our movement. And I don't know what's going on in the group chats, but I know the public stance was, solidarity, immediate solidarity after that happened, and that felt really important because there was, I think, and there continues to be, an effort to dismiss this movement because, some fires were set, maybe some windows got busted. And I think that's an important thing, I think, also for anybody who's allied with this movement to defend Black lives should be continuing to stay focused on the reasons why we're doing this and not get distracted by, these conversations around some of the tactics. Yeah.
So thank you all for that. Right before I wrote the piece that I did for In These Times, someone sent me an article from a newspaper in New Jersey, and it was the article was written by this right winger, and his argument was very explicit. He said that he acknowledged the issue of police violence and said that the problem was not racism, but the problem was public sector unionism. And that the issue of public sector unions leads to a matter where there is a lack of accountability. And rather than voice my own opinion about this, I'm curious how you all respond, because that was in writing, but I've heard this, and I've even heard versions of that espoused by people that claim to be on the left. What do you do? What do you do with that? Scott.
Yeah, I don't buy that, that this is about public sector unions. I mean, speaking of, I grew up in a union household, my mom was a teacher, so I definitely don't buy that. There's a big difference. But overall, I think there is this debate around how to interpret the role of police unions in enabling this continued kind of violence, misconduct, over policing of Black communities. And yeah, there's a school of thought, I think even on the left, that says the problem is that police are unionized, right? Like, I don't really go for that. I think police should have as long as we have police, they should be able to organize as workers. My objection is with their agenda, right? And the kind of three things, right? Just the lack of accountability for police officers that police unions work towards, which I think is extreme. I saw there's a question in Q&A around what is in these police contracts. There's a lot of protections that I think go beyond what we see mostly in organized labor, but also that there are protections that are they're just different when they're applied to police officers. For instance, some police contracts or beyond the contracts, there are also these bills of police and law enforcement Bill of Rights that have been passed in some states that prevent police officers from being immediately questioned if they're involved in a shooting, by internal affairs or what have you, right? Like, that's a differentiation that places someone above the law, right? There's no one else in America who can shoot someone, be suspected of having committed murder or homicide, and then can tell the police, well, you can't talk to me for 3 days. That's what is written into the law, right? So those types of protections that just make it impossible to have accountability with police officers. Perhaps more importantly, the overall agenda to block reform, not just of policing, but of criminal justice reform generally. The police unions spend millions of dollars. They leverage their kind of bully pulpit as law enforcement to block the agenda. And then we see them launching really vicious attacks on reformers. I know that we've done a lot of work at Color Change to try to transform prosecutors' offices locally, and there's been a number of folks elected and who are making policy changes, and over again, especially the Black women in these positions in places like Chicago, Boston, Maryland, where Marilyn Mosby prosecuted the Freddie Gray, the officers responsible for Freddie Gray's killing. The vicious attacks that are often racially and gender coded. These, to me, those things just don't resonate with what I understand is the best of the labor movement. So no, I don't buy into the idea that it's the unionizing itself or the organizing of workers itself that's the problem. I think police unions are really distinct in that they are really, in opposition to everything the rest of us believe in terms of fairness, wanting to build a system that's more just, and dealing with racism in America. So yeah, I think the problem is more their agenda than their ability to organize.
Tiffany, are police?
Are you about to come in?
Actually, I want to direct a variation on that. Are police unions reformable?
Yes. So I'm gonna answer both. The first, I want to answer what you asked Scott also, though, because when we say public sector workers, I need folks to know what that coded language means. Most of public sector workers are women, and most of them are young people. And most of them, are young people, and most of them are people of color. So I'm looking at the Economic Policy Institute, and I'm looking at the Office of National Statistics, and both of them are saying that mostly people of color are those who are in the public sector. And so that attack on using coded language like public sector versus police, I think disenfranchises women and disenfranchises people of color. And I don't think that we should use language that puts workers of color who have been marginalized against white workers, who most police officers are white. And so are teachers. And so to answer your question about the reform piece, the question is absolutely yes. There have been multiple agendas that have been launched about reform. The NAACP has taken a very large national and global stance on that. And I think that they can be. We've seen with the youth that I work with at the NAACP, I work with 300 chapters across the country. We put out a call after the University of Minneapolis student body president. Her name is Jael Karundi. She's the first Black female president at that school for the student government, mostly white school, or historically white school rather. And she wrote a letter to her chancellor asking them to kick the police off the campus, and then outlined in the letter a bunch of demands with kicking them off the campus. The chancellor responded to that letter in a matter of 9 hours and responded to agree to some of those demands, but not all of them. My office then reached out to Jael Karundi, the student body president there, pulled together a training and a toolkit in a matter of 12 hours. And on our first training call that we had the next morning at 9 a.m., there were 300 schools, high schools, middle schools, colleges, parents, faculty, educators. I even had school board members that were on there. And right now we have 11 schools who have written petitions and written letters to their leadership on campus to also get them to cut the contract or to ask for reforms. So like the Florida Agricultural Mechanical University and the Florida State University have written a letter asking for certain reforms of what they want to see of the police on off campus who come on campus to deal with the situations. And so I don't think, where I'm positioned at now, I don't think there is one solution in the short term. I think in the short term, we have to defund, we have to reform, and we can abolish at the same time, depending on where we are in the country. We've seen, for example, Portland Public Schools do the exact same thing with schools and campus safety officers. We've seen in Minneapolis, like I mentioned, with the university there and how their relationship has changed. And then we're seeing in some places like New York and LA where they're like, we're not about to abolish the police, but we will talk about rerouting funding so that we can fund public services as opposed to giving $19 million more to the police, which is what our mayor here in Washington, D.C. is demanding to do. I went to the city council meeting a few days ago here in D.C., and the debate in city council in of itself was depressing and disgusting to hear, because there are essential services that help people that have never gotten the funding, the adequate funding that they need to be successful for all the folks in the city, for all the folks in DC. And instead, the proposition to increase the budget to $19 million is the one that's being considered. And so to answer your question about reform, that is one of the plenty of options that we have on the list.
But so first of all, I'm going to ask each of you to tighten up your responses a little bit, because I'm looking at the clock and realizing that we're going to be opening up for questions soon. But the question I asked you was actually not about reform of policing. I asked you where the police unions were reformable.
Yes.
Okay.
Same reason.
And you feel like you have seen.
Now you asked me, are they reformable? You didn't say,
Yes.
Will they reform?
No, are they reformable?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. All right, we'll come back to that. Katie, are police unions reformable?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I totally agree with Tiffany. I think that it is possible, but I will say in my own experience, I've worked for MLK Labor for the last 4 years, and we've spent time defending our local police guild in their contract negotiations, in their fight for our contract. And we've spent times having conversations about institutional racism and public safety with members of the Police Guild's executive board and other members of our labor council who have more advanced anti-racism programs inside their unions, in an attempt to try and show the police union what it would mean to bargain for the common good, what it would mean to advance an anti-racism agenda inside their union or inside their guild. And I will just tell you that what I saw with my own eyes was that it did not occur. Like, it was not meaningful. And that's not to say that the vision isn't beautiful. That's not to say that it's not possible. It's simply to say that I haven't seen it happen, and that where there was a really good faith effort, shown by labor union leaders here in Seattle to support the police contract with an expectation that the police guild would then advance, that the police union would try to establish community trust, and that the police union would work with our labor partners to advance some sort of anti-racism agenda. At this point, I just feel was naive, and is it possible? Yes. I haven't seen it.
So where does the role of debate come in? There are, by most assessments, about a quarter to a third of union members who regularly vote Republican. Their people's views of police are all over the map. There have been, in a number of unions, that have taken public stands around the Floyd murder and the rebellions. There have been serious pushbacks from people, or an ambiguity around how to respond because of a fear of, well, in a nutshell, people feel we need police. So, where does the debate arise within our ranks? I mean, we're not talking about a few hundred people. We're not talking about a nonprofit. We're talking about a movement that has at least 16 million people nationally, as well as people that we're connected with. Where does the role of debate come in? So I'm gonna start with you, Katie.
What do you mean by the role of debate? What do you mean?
I don't see much of it.
Are you asking what the debate is and what it should be?
Oh, I don't think that there is much of a debate. I think there's a subterranean debate. And there's a subterranean debate that's been going on for years about the role of law enforcement. But there's no public debate. The thing that you were saying, Tiffany, earlier on about a level of fear at some level of surfacing these issues. And so now we go from a situation where there's a level of fear and things not being surfaced to all of a sudden expulsion. And I'm asking, where does debate come in? When we know that we have a significant percentage of union members that are at least ambivalent about how to approach the police, where does debate fit in our agenda? Who wants to respond?
I was stalling for Katie.
Okay, Katie, you've been nominated.
No, I didn't nominate her. She was talking, and I wanted to get clarity on the question.
Well, I mean, I don't feel like I fully understand the question, but I'll just say, like, I think we've got to have the conversation. You know, obviously, unions that represent other law enforcement officers, I think, are feeling uncomfortable right now. You know, unions who represent ICE agents, corrections officers, because we haven't ruled on the question of like what we do with those workers' unions. And I think that's like a conversation we have to have amongst ourselves. But, you know, what for me is the most important debate is I think most of us in organized labor believe that police officers can have their union. Like, they are workers, they can have their unions. But the question that we have been asked is, what is the role of a police union in a labor federation? And on that question, you know, you said it too, like, we don't have to accept anybody who wants to be a member of our organization. We don't have to accept Amazon. We don't have to accept the Chamber of Commerce or the Goodwill. Like, we don't have to accept people who don't share our common interests. And so that's the conversation I think all of us need to be having as a movement, is like, what is our individual union's commitment to racial justice, and what do we want our broad labor federations to be fighting for?
Tiffany, you were gonna respond also?
I mean, I'm struggling with the question too, to be honest with you, Bill. I feel like, you know, like I said, I've been working in labor since 2015, 2014, and the debate is played out. And so I know that you're asking because we're talking about unions specifically, but what I'm looking for in this moment is not the debate and who needs to have it and what that debate is, because I don't even think we've named the debate outside of like kicking labor. We've all kind of agreed, and I agree with this, like, yes, they can have a union. My problem is when the union protects murderers and when legislation and policy are under union protections. I think that, you know, when, like you said earlier in the beginning, we're looking for the names of officers who have killed people and the union's protecting them. We're looking for people to get convicted, people to go to trial, and the union rules and stuff can protect people. And so I don't have an answer for the debate part of this question. I don't think there is a debate. I think the debate is happening with folks who are still too afraid to come to the table and have the discussion around analysis and solutions. And I know that when I've watched all 50 states across the country have protests, that's clear to me that we don't need to have a debate. That's clear to me that we have a problem and that folks need to fix it.
But how can you say we don't need a debate? We have police units that are in AFSCME, SEIU, Teamsters, UFCW, AFGE, right?
And
so conceivably, you're asking each of those unions to get rid of their law enforcement units, right? I mean, it's like, let's just be clear. This ain't just about cops. There were ICE agents that were caging people. So if we're talking about law enforcement, then let's talk about law enforcement. And doesn't that mean that there's going to have to be some sort of debate? Or do you think that this is going to be basically just about passing resolutions and throwing people out?
I mean, outside of the article that you wrote, who else is calling for people to kick out police unions?
A lot of people have been calling
What
for
I'm
kicking.
saying, what I'm saying is from the community side that I work on, nobody has called for that. That's why I'm saying there's not a debate. And maybe that's my ignorance because I'm not aware, but the people that I work with, the coalitions that I'm a part of and the folks that we have, the reason why I mentioned earlier, defund, reform, and abolish is because in those in those recommendations for platforms, there is no debate whether or not workers should be able to unionize.
No, I'm making a distinction between whether people should unionize or kicking them out of unions. See,
Kicking individuals out of unions?
Individual unions.
Right, kicking
out
of.
Like, in other words, what happened in Seattle. Katie described for us that they were approached by community people as well as some of their own members. And as a result, they passed a resolution and they removed the police, right? And I'm saying that throughout the union movement, you've got, see, I look at it like this, and I'm stepping sort of out of my role as a moderator here. I'm looking at that law enforcement traditionally plays a very conservative role in the union movement and basically obstructs our ability to have discussions repeatedly. But the problem is they're there. Now the question is, how do you move a discussion that calls into question the role of law enforcement and their even being there? And so, like, if you have a union like AFGE that has 3 large units, ICE, Border Patrol, and Bureau of Prisons, right, all in law enforcement, are you saying that AFGE should push them out, right? And are people prepared to engage in that kind of discussion? Because it's not going to happen based on just resolutions or good wishes. You're asking the unions to not simply expel. The easy one is the IUPA and the AFL-CIO. That's very easy. But if you're ask me, get rid of law enforcement, you're saying get rid of sheriffs, cops, prison guards, etc. You think that's going to happen outside of a debate? Outside of pressure?
I'll defer to other folks on this because I don't think it is strategic or comprehensive of the goals that we're looking for to kick out unions. That's where I'm at, and that's with the partners. And the NAACP hasn't called for that, and so I think that the solutions that we're looking for just have a different tactic and a different strategy.
That's good. I appreciate that. So deepen that. Just go further with it, with your point in playing that out.
I think so. I mean, there's so many levels of inception that we can go on. And I know you said we're short on time. There's so many levels of inception that we can go into when we're talking about kicking out unions for whatever the debate that is being had, whatever the criteria is that says we're going to kick you out of the union because of these things. Or are we isolating just carceral, like police and law enforcement and all those folks? Are we kicking just those folks out? I don't know what that rubric is, but the labor movement has a bigger problem on its hand than just kicking out labor unions that don't want to come to the table and participate or reform. And kicking them out doesn't solve any of the problems that I think I see when you ask the first initial question about George Floyd. Mm-hmm. I don't see how the two things correlate or how one gets us from point A to point B. What I am talking about is not kicking out police unions and not allowing police to unionize. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is very clear, which is folks are looking for accountability and for justice. And the labor movement has an obligation to not just speak out and show up at the march, but to present a list of policy ideas that align with community members and civil rights organizations that do this work, and then hold their feet to the fire and be a part of legislation. I don't know how many folks watched the entire Senate hearing on that Lee Merritt and Kamala Harris and all these other folks who are part of, I think it was Tuesday or whatever it was. But there were a lot of disturbing comments in there as well. And I didn't hear police unions come up not one time, at least in the time that I was watching, and I watched the whole thing. So I don't think that that gets to the solution of saving Black lives, which is why I'm not a part of that debate, which is why I don't think that's a useful debate to have. I think that's an easy cop out to say, oh, we kicked him out, look at us. That does not get rid of the problem of policing in this country.
Tiffany, you answered my question. Thank you. That was definitely the direction I wanted to go. And what I want to say, it's 57 minutes after the hour. And what I want to do is, we have like 45,000 questions that have come in. And, and so we're going to try to answer some, and I'm going to ask them, and whoever wants to, I'm going to ask some of them. Whoever wants to respond, please feel free. One of the questions that came in is about, there are police associations of people of color, like there's a Black law enforcement group and others. And where do they fit into this debate? Are they of use? Are they potential allies? Are they covering for the other side? And whoever wants to respond to that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, they can be really positive influences. There's the Black police associations in particular tend to recognize and acknowledge the racism inherent in policing. And just public polling shows, or like studies of police officers shows, that there's a huge racial divide, even, within overall police force, nationally, that shows that Black officers recognize the racial biases within policing and that white officers tend not to. Also, police unions tend to be led overwhelmingly by white men, almost without fail. And they typically are led by folks who have benefited the most from the union, which tend to be people who have been accused of the most misconduct, right? So people who they develop the most investment in the unions, and they end up leading them. And this is why we see a lot of times we see such extreme behavior from police unions in response to police killings, defending even some of the most obvious examples. But I think that I feel like I've forgotten what the question was at this point. I'm sorry.
You're too young to forget the question.
I know.
It was about the role. It was about the. I couldn't resist that, man. That's what happens when you get my age. The question was about the role of people of color police associations, and whether
right.
they're allies.
To how white and crooked the leadership of the police unions are. But I think, what the difference is that there's a lot of these Black police organizations were founded to deal with institutional racism within police departments, right? So at their root, they are actually there to deal with racism, where I think we may diverge from some of the Black-led policing organizations is, when it gets down to some of like the contract negotiations, right? Obviously, they want the really strong protections for police officers as well, but they're more likely to support like legislative changes, things like that, or just to push back publicly against some of the more, frankly, racist statements that sometimes come from police unions, in my experience. So I think they're overall, definitely preferred to most of the unions, I would say.
My next question is to Katie, actually. Someone raised 45% of the delegates voted against expelling. What are you going to do with them?
I should have a debate.
Yeah, I think this is like the first, this is the first big move we've made on like I would say the first really public thing we've done on racial equity or racial justice work, and for our institution. And I think that the next step for us is to advance an internal program. You know, I mean, I think like we've got to have conversations with each other about what our role is in this current moment. Because, you know, Tiffany, I think we all can acknowledge that expelling the police union was one step, and it is like very symbolic. And, but there's real work to be done with each other, you know? And if we're gonna advance, let's say, a policy agenda that is in line with what Black Lives Matter leaders are calling for in the city of Seattle, we don't advance that kind of policy work without having an internal debate, you know? So I think the next thing is like, we're gonna start talking about what does it mean to defund the police? What does it mean to reallocate funding for other forms of public service? I mean, we're not gonna kick those people out. I think we're just gonna keep having the conversation about what comes next.
Well, let's talk a little bit about this defunding. Tiffany, a few years ago, my daughter had a gun pointed at her head by a mugger. And I assume if someone has a gun and it points that they're prepared to use it. Who was she going to call?
The police.
And how does that relate to defunding?
She's going to call the police. We've seen, I've seen that police respond slower to poor communities and Black folks anyway. Defunding, the language of it is triggering for some folks because it sounds new, but it's actually not. We defund education all the time. I went to University of California, Santa Cruz, and when I was in school between 2007 and 2011, for every $1 spent on a student, that was $7 spent on an inmate. And they increased my college tuition almost 100% in a matter of 4 years. My tuition got increased almost 100% in a matter of 4 years. But for every one student the state spent on, $1 the student spent on by the state, $7 per person that was incarcerated. So we defund public services and goods all the time. We're not asking for cutting salaries or cutting police from the police department. What we're advocating for and what folks are saying in this narrative around defunding the police is, instead of giving $19 million to the police department, how about we aid and fund other really important services that also provide safety and preventative programs so that folks don't get into situations that they're in already anyway. Let's provide programs so that students and young people aren't already on the streets. Let's provide programs and things so that folks have the mental health care that they actually need before problems blow up in people's faces. And so that rerouting of the money is not a new phenomenon. That's already been happening. And I know that folks get really triggered, and I saw, the police officer in Buffalo yelling at people saying that people need to have their back and they've been villainized and et cetera, et cetera. That same police department had a woman named Carol Horn who years ago was trying to stop a white police officer from choking and killing a Black man. And that police force fired her and cut her pension. And so there's a campaign right now to get her pension restored, and that was a Black woman. And so when we talk about defunding, right, it's not the attack on salaries and pensions and workers. The police union does that already to Black people as it is. We're saying reroute that money so we can give it to public services so that folks in the community can get the help that they need before they get into problems like that. But to answer your question, they're gonna call the police. And I hope, Bill, here's the problem. I hope and pray that in situations like that, you don't have another situation that repeats itself like Breonna Taylor. You don't have another situation that repeats itself like George Floyd or like Tamir Rice, when someone that's white or anybody else calls the police and the police show up, and instead of de-escalating the situation and helping to disarm the actual criminal, they shoot somebody and kill somebody innocent, because that is the problem that we're seeing.
Thank you. Scott, in all of the discussions, I shouldn't say all, it's in many of the discussions about police unions, people talk about, and we talked a little bit about it here, collective bargaining agreements that have make it more difficult for there to be accountability. But collective bargaining agreements are signed with employers. And in this case, it's the governments. So yeah, the police unions may be doing this, but why are governments agreeing to such provisions and then later claiming that there's nothing that they can do?
Great, fantastic question. And I think I can't really speak to the defund piece as well. I mean, which is connected to, like, you know, why we can't get defund. But I think we are talking about shrinking the size and scope. Like, I think starting from a place of, like, if I'm being mugged, who do I call? Which is, like, you know, it's kind of a false question, because police don't just show up and stop you from being mugged, right? They investigate afterwards, and most of the time, majority of the time, don't solve the crime. But the question is, do we need to call the police if I'm asleep in the Wendy's drive-thru, right? Like, we need to start at that level of what do the police really need to respond to. A mugging, you know, it's kind of hard to argue with that until we have some other response unit for something like that. But do we need, you know, police to clear benches from houseless people, you know, in parks, you know, or should we be sending someone else who's better equipped to respond to that piece? So I think when we talk about defunding the police, we're talking about the scope of police, not just the size, right? What are those roles that they don't necessarily need to play? But to your question around collective bargaining agreements and why they get passed, right? The police unions wield a ton of political power. As I was saying earlier, it's not just through political contributions, but, you know, all labor unions do that to greater or lesser success. But police unions are really distinctly positioned. They represent the police. One of the part of the work that we've been doing is trying to talk to newspapers about better distinguishing police union spokespeople from police spokespeople. Oftentimes, when they are in the media, they seem to speak for the police, not just like the rank and file, but for leadership. They have, you know, really, they are close to delegate information, right? Police unions are often, we believe, behind the leaks of attacks against politicians. You know, may hold, you know, if you catch the senator on his way home a little tipsy and you give him a ride instead of arresting him, you can bring that up later when it's time to vote on your collective bargaining agreement. These are stories I've heard that are real, I think. So I think there's a lot of, like, soft power that police unions also have to give them leverage. And then there has been for decades, there's something I think that's just starting to turn in the last few years, which is just an overall trend in American politics where you want to be seen as tough on crime, right? And so anything not seen as supporting police is, like, treacherous. And I think that's why policing became that third rail, even as criminal justice reform began to build momentum. Policing became that third rail where you kind of couldn't touch it, because if you're seen as opposing the police, you're seen as being soft on crime, not caring about people's safety. And I think that's why this conversation around defund, around divesting from policing and investing in our communities, is really meant to reframe and help people reimagine what public safety can look like. Because if we can't imagine it beyond policing, then we'll always be in this situation where I think the political incentives for the politicians who are coming to these agreements with police unions will speak to them and say that, you know, they have to give in, that accountability is less important than people feeling like you're being tough on crime, things of that nature.
Katie, could you imagine a situation where the King County Central Labor Council and its affiliates were to jump into a situation where the cops are negotiating with the city or the county, and the council took issue with a bargaining position articulated by the police union?
Yeah, perhaps, you know, the position, like the resolution that like initially began the process to expel the Seattle Police Officers Guild, one of the components of the resolution was saying that we were going to work with the Seattle Police Officers Guild to make sure that their next round of collective bargaining did not evade legitimate accountability. And, you know, so I think that like the first step would be for us to communicate to the police guild that if they were taking a position that was evading legitimate accountability, and that our community partners were calling on us to take that position, and our affiliate unions were calling on us to take that position, we would probably first have a conversation with the police guild and explain to them that they were putting all public sector unions and all unions at risk by using their bargaining power to evade accountability, and that, you know, we would try and have internal pressure to get them to, you know, adjust that position. But yeah, it's conceivable that if they were taking on a position through their collective bargaining process that unions felt was so egregious, we would publicly oppose. I think that's a possibility. I wouldn't have said that 2 years ago, but current day, yes.
I want to pose a question to the three of you. This has been raised by a number of people in the chat and Q&A, which is, are cops workers? And does that make any difference? That is, does your answer to that question make any difference in terms of how we look at this debate right now? Tiffany, you want to start?
Sure. Yes, cops are workers. Does it change any of my answers or the debate right now? No.
Okay. Scott.
Yeah, I think police are workers. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of argument out there that says police are maybe closer to the military, right? And maybe that puts them in a different category of worker. I mean, I feel like someone in the military is a worker also. So, but maybe puts them in a different category where we should maybe look at them a little different. But, you know, I think if you get up, go to work in the morning, like that, or even if you don't, if you're be a mom or whatever, like if you're working, that makes you a worker. So I don't, you know, I feel like it's a level of splitting hairs that is less important than dealing with the agenda of police unions.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Cops are workers. They have the power to use their union to bargain for the common good. And that's what we would like to see them do. You know, teachers have a tradition of, we've seen teachers unions bargain for an end to disproportionate discipline to Black and brown students, to end the school to prison pipeline. The police could do the same thing with their bargaining power. And that's what we would like to see. You know, that's the possibility and the power of them having a union. We have not yet seen that. That doesn't mean it's not possible.
But are we facing a particular kind of problem given what the role of the police, not police unions, the role of police in society? I mean, the police, first and foremost, exist to defend property and to defend the rich, and have been used against workers since time immemorial. Does that say something to us about this entire debate? And in some ways, does it really get to the extent to which the institution of policing, or but more particularly in this case, police unions, can be reformed, given what the role that the police occupy in society? Police and law enforcement more generally. Whoever wants to answer that.
Well, police and law enforcement don't have to occupy the role that they currently occupy in society. Like, it could be different. That's how, you know, we've all been talking about what it would mean to send a social worker to deal with someone who is in a mental health crisis, you know? And so it doesn't mean that police officers' only job should be to protect property. Like, they could have other, we could reframe their job or reorganize their department.
Tiffany?
Still trying to think about the answer. Give me a second.
I think on it. Scott.
Yeah, I mean, picking up on what Katie was saying, I think, as I said earlier, I think, you know, we do have to, we're in a point where I think people are calling for a reimagining of what public safety looks like. And so, right, is that the role that we want police to play going forward? And I think probably the problem is that police unions are invested in the status quo. It has benefited them greatly, more money, more protections for their members. And if we can ever get to the point where we can move police unions like we moved teachers unions around school to prison pipeline, right? Katie, that's an excellent example, right? Just like, but it seems like, yeah, I think there's a question. And I think that's why we have called for, you know, the labor union to kind of the labor movement to distance itself from police unions, because feel very doubtful that like, that they can change, given that they're not only created, as you said, Bill, for like these purposes that aren't really aligned with the labor movement's purposes, but every day they get deeper and deeper entwined in profiting from that and the status quo. So, yeah, I think it's a tough question.
Okay. Tiffany, you come up with one?
No, but I was reading a comment. Magali, I hope I pronounced your name right, said, "I'm sorry, this is just very frustrating that these panelists representing these huge platforms continue to re-envision policing in other forms. It's scary and dangerous." And so I think, you know, I think that to your question, Bill, it's not just the role of policing in that question that come from the systematic oppression of slavery, right? That is connected to economics, that's connected to capitalism, that's connected to racism, that's connected to patriarchy, that's connected to all the things. And so I'm still processing that. And I agree with what Katie and Scott have said. I'm just trying to process if I have a different answer, a different way to think about it. So if I do, I'll tweet about it later.
All right, that's fair. So we're moving towards the end, and I want to ask the three of you this. So let's say that tomorrow you were invited before the AFL-CIO Executive Council.
I'm not going.
To make recommendations. No, you're going. I'm going to make sure you get there. You're there to make recommendations on what the union movement needs to be doing right now in the face of this larger crisis. What would be your top three recommendations? Now, some of this, Tiffany, you said a little bit about earlier, but I want to give each of you an opportunity as we move towards wrapping up. What would be the main things that the union movement needs to be doing? And I'm not just talking about what it needs to be saying. What does the union movement need to be doing in the context of this crisis that we're in? Who wants to go first?
I can start us off.
Good, man.
We can finish strong. I just wrote down three things. You said three, so I tried to do that really quickly. I think there's like, you know, there's a question around push out and call out, meaning like should labor be pushing unions away? I think that's a real debate that needs to happen internally, but I think at minimum there has to be a call out. We've seen some of that. Like the NFL did call out Bob Kroll, who's the leader of the police union in Minneapolis, when he was, you know, being obstinate in the midst of the crisis that's going on there. So I think labor needs to be really visible in responding to police unions when they're clearly violating the values of the labor movement and continuing to clarify for people where organized labor stands. would be one thing. I think that labor should be looking internally. I think every single institution in the country should be looking internally right now as we all wrestle with, you know, the continuing legacy of racism and just ongoing systemic racism in the country. You know, what is the unfinished work within the labor movement? How do we make sure there are pathways to leadership within the labor movement for Black folks and other people of color? And what are just the structural obstacles for Black labor organizing? And finally is the thing I think Tiffany's been saying throughout, which is develop a real commitment, put real resources behind supporting the agenda for real structural change in public safety. Yeah, those would be the three things for me.
Thank you. Katie, just have a few minutes.
The first thing I think is identifying and aligning ourselves with Black-led civil rights organizations and trying to follow their leadership around what the demands are and using our policy and political power to elevate those demands. I think the second thing is, this is a little bit redundant to what Scott said, but being willing to admit when our institutions, when either our individual unions are, how do I say this? We've got to be willing to say that our core values are to fight for racial, social, and economic justice, and that the institution of the union is not more important than those values, than that mission, and that we are willing to say when our union has been, when our causes have been obscured, or when our union has been used to fight social, racial, or economic justice. Like, we have to be able to draw a distinction and say, like, that's not the purpose. And then, yeah, so that's two. I'll tell you if I come up with a third.
Tiffany, you got 2 minutes.
Leslie McSpadden, who was the mother of Michael Brown, was a UFCW member. And when I had the hearing in Ferguson with the AFL-CIO, they didn't even want to invite her to come and speak. So the labor movement first needs to really, really deal with, not talk about, not write a statement, not do a training, deal with its own internal racism that they have. And that means not delegating your racial problems to your constituency groups. The second thing that they need to do is, I would love to see if the AFL-CIO has a platform list of recommendations around reforming or whatever police unions. That's the only time I would ever endorse or say that they need to have a debate, because I'm actually not interested in anything that they have to debate and fight about right now. The third is they need to hire people of color who can and should do this work, who are directly impacted. Because when I worked there, my superiors were all white men who told me that my experience was not valid, and that the things that I was advocating for or suggested that they do weren't real solutions. I do believe that if America listens to Black women, we'd be in a different place. And if they would have listened to me back in 2015, we might not be in the situation we were in right now. And then I know that was 3, but the fourth one is I'm going to ditto what Scott said about donating to organizations.
Thank you. Thank you all very, very much. I'm going to turn this back over to Elizabeth, but I want to thank you each for your candid and really high-level responses and exchange. Thank you all very, very much.
Thanks for being a great moderator, Bill.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all, Katie, Scott, Tiffany, and Bill. That was fantastic. Absolutely gave all of us a lot to think about and also a lot to do. And hopefully all the folks here are in the position of going back and actually, doing the work. I think that's a great kind of place for us to end this conversation today. Thank you to everyone who logged in, sent your questions. We will be posting this, so we recorded it, and we will be sending it out via email, via the email address that you registered, and potentially posting it on another platform. So please do stay tuned for that. And with that, we will sign off. Thanks, everyone.